Hello and welcome to the BYU Family History Library webinar series. We're glad you could join us today. I'm Anna Aller, and I'll be your host for this webinar. If you have technical difficulties during the webinar, please use the chat box and I can address your concerns. You're welcome to use the chat box during the webinar for comments, insights, and questions. However, all questions will be addressed at the end of the presentation. Our next webinar will be on May 12th with Catherine Grant on Census 101 Basics, Benefits, and Cautions. If you would like to access a previous webinar, please visit our webinar index on our website or search on our YouTube channel. All of our webinars are recorded and uploaded by the following Monday for your convenience. We also post links to recordings and other updates on our Facebook and Twitter accounts. For today's webinar, we are pleased to hear from Madhu Menon, who will be giving a presentation on Loving Ties and Family Trees, Roots of South Asian Subcontinental Diaspora. Madhu Menon grew up in South Asia in a loving family. He was pampered and nurtured by his parents, siblings, and a large, close-knit extended family. His introduction to family history came through his spouse and her family's extensive genealogy that goes back many generations. The two of them together have collected Madhu's family history through oral history from every senior member of the family for a few decades now, along with a few hard copy records in the form of memoirs that some family members recorded. Now their contributions are found in Family Search, Ancestry, and MyHeritage, among various archives. He enjoys poetry and journaling. And Madhu, if you're ready, we'll turn the time over to you and you can share your screen.
Thank you, Anna. Well, I want to thank those who invited and encouraged me to do this webinar, as well as all those who contributed over many decades and helped compile my family history. As well as those who helped me prepare this webinar presentation. I'm not an expert or professional genealogist or family history scholar. This invitation to present at this webinar has helped me reflect on elements of my family history, and particularly how I went about the research experience, and then identify structure and patterns for research that have proven helpful to me and I hope is helpful to others. Thank you for joining me on this exploration of family history research in South Asia. And more specifically, some of the examples will be related to the very southern part of South Asia. Whatever your interest and motivation, I hope you'll find some takeaway that will prove helpful in your life from this pursuit as it has been to mine. Loving ties is the basic motivation that has led me to family history research and compilation. My life has been enriched by the invaluable contributions of so many who have passed on, as well as my contemporaries. A family tree or family chart, such as a fan chart or other forms, help provide a visual representation of the roots and branches of this treasured history, connecting the present with the past for the benefit of the future. Now, this here shows the subcontinent, and I've chosen to refer to it as South Asian subcontinent simply to reflect the contemporary political geography of the area, which consists of many countries. For example, they include India, Pakistan, Nepal, Bhutan, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Maldives, and by some accounts, Afghanistan. The fundamental principle that drives this presentation is my belief that small and simple means lend great meaning and purpose, not only in family history, but in general. The value of this pursuit of family history is incalculable to me. How does one ever put a value to life lessons we learn from one another that lends greater meaning and purpose to our own life and enriches us with that bequeathal? It is not that we are perfect or our history is perfect, but we can learn from the experiences of those who have gone before and leave a legacy of our own experiences for those who come after us. Which is why family history is just as much about compiling historical records about the family as it is about keeping contemporary records of our own life to pass on to future generations. Our stories matter. Now, We'll examine family history in this webinar through 4 lenses. First, the lens of names with their meanings and origins, followed by the lens of languages with their origins and variations. And then locations, and I have chosen to look at that through the lens of diasporas or promised lands, dispersions, and where immigrants were destined for. And then lastly, I'd like to look at the connections, the commonality, the diversity, universality, and eternity. Now here, we see various names from the subcontinent. There are examples here of given names, as well as family names or surnames and other parts of names, which I'll define later to lend context to this, to those who are unacquainted with the names of this region. These examples are in no way representative of the diverse names that originate from South Asia. Names from this region, as in other places, typically have some meaning. Often those meanings come from religious contexts, here too reflecting the great diversity of religions that exist in this region. There are many religions and religious sects found in practice in this geographic area. The religious context can generally aid traceability and guide family history research. In this sampling, there are names from Hindu, Muslim, Christian, Parsi, Buddhist, Jain, and Sikh origins. Let's see if you can pick some of these as I bring those up. Rama, an example of a name from a Hindu origin. Likewise, Krishna, or the combination of the two, Rama, Krishna, all originating from Hindu background. Now, take a look at this one, Abdul, or Azra, or Ali, all from Muslim background. Matthew, Paul, from Christian background. Or there could be names such as Vimal, which might apply to potentially multiple backgrounds from a religious context. Increasingly, you find that type of a borrowal between that are not necessarily specific to religion. I just pulled up the name Tata, a Parsi background, or here's one from a Sikh background, Singh. And by no means are these exclusive, but to a particular religion, but to some extent, you find a commonality there, a predominant religion representing some of these names. Now let me attempt to offer some structure by focusing on naming conventions. The sheer variety of naming conventions in use in this area will not permit me to share more than one example in detail in the time that we have. The example, however, will illustrate how distinct and unconventional this naming structure might seem to those unacquainted with this type of nomenclature. The naming convention of first, middle name, and last name, etc., simply do not lend itself very well to the diverse naming conventions of this region. The moment we go down that path of first, middle, and last name with a multitude of Indian naming conventions and try to fit it into that mold, we will find ourselves in a confusing melee of comical concoctions that can at best only serve up chuckles for generations to come. It's like the proverbial attempt at trying to fit a square peg in a round hole. By the same token, possibly some of you who are unfamiliar with the regional naming convention might get a chuckle out of what I'm about to share. This example of naming convention is taken from southern India. It is obviously anglicized with which lends to the sense of absurdity to the uninitiated because the caricatural effects stemming from the unusual cultural and contextual displacement. Let me illustrate. The formal name, Vadakke Parambil Raman Tamburan, in this context of this particular Southern Indian naming convention, simply translates into English as shown at the bottom, Northern Fields Raman Lord, or Northern Fields Raman Lordship. Using, such an elaborate convention is not uncommon in the region. This is the order in which a person's name is formally referred to in speech and writing where this convention is in use. Let's try another example. In this case, this fictitious gentleman's fictitious spouse. Tekke Parambil Remani Amma. Now that last piece of that name as ordered in this convention can find many variants according to context. Using this lady as an example, indeed as a spouse of a lordship, she could be considered a lady. Therefore, Ramani Amma could be called Ramani Tamburati. Tamburan for lordship and Tamburati for lady. You might have guessed that this has similarities to feudal conventions. Further, in less formal or more filial settings, this lady's name Amma or mother might change to Chechi, meaning sister. Thus, in some contexts, she might be Tekke Parambil Ramani Chechi to close associates of hers that are along the lines of younger siblings. Or if she was the youngest sibling to another brother or sister, then she would be Tekke Parambil Ramani Aniti, meaning younger sister, as opposed to elder sister. There's some other peculiarities. The reference to Amma or mother in the name is common in this region and does not necessarily connote childbearing, but rather a general respectful way of associating femininity with mothering or nurturing. Similarly, the convention can lead to some conjugations that blend various components of this naming convention. Vadakke Parambil Raman Tamburan could very well also be Vadakke Parambil Ramachan Tamburan. Northern Fields Raman Father Lordship. The Achan being father, thus the conjugate of Raman and Achan becomes Ramachan. Now let's see if you can decode this naming convention into its components. This particular convention is as follows for the full name of the person. As you might have recognized by now, the first part is a geographic designation, as in Vadakke or Northern, or Tekke or Southern, immediately followed by the family name. In this case, Fields, or in Malayalam, Parambil, which stands for fields. And then the given name, in this case, Raman or Ramani. And finally, the social occupational background, or it might be a class or community or a caste, depending on the religious context. So thus we see one example and the variety that just one example lends. And unfortunately, we won't be able to tackle more, but we can dive deeper into this one from the standpoint of how this might aid research. So I'd like to point out three identifiers. From the perspective of family history research, this naming convention can be dissected into the components of the convention to further aid in traceability. So using our previous naming convention and example, we can find at least three identifiers. geographic locations, linguistics or religious origins, and social or occupational backgrounds. Notice that given names such as Samuel or Rama or Abdul alone do not offer great potential for traceability. But when an identifier is evident, such as a linguistic variation, for example, Rama is referred to as Raman. That's a variation by adding an N towards the end. This would start cluing us into the name as possibly originating in southern India and perhaps even the state of Kerala, as opposed to being Rama, which could be much broader and more specifically perhaps common in northern India. But that part alone necessarily may not give us the certainty that we need as to the origin. Supposing the name was Teke Parambil, similar to southern fields, now we increase the certainty of Kerala origins. Further, suppose a social or occupational background or community or caste name is attached to the name, such as Tamburan or Nair. Now we have certainty that confirms the person's roots as Malayali or Keralite from a Hindu religious background. So what we see here in this type of method is when one or two identifiers are available, then using a triangulation method, we could possibly bring greater certainty to the third identifier and to the origin. Now, naming conventions may also reveal origins based on how they apply to genders. For instance, the convention used in our example from southern India is gender neutral. You saw that it was the same structure applied to both male and female names. But within the same region, there are other conventions that are gender specific. For example, the names ending in Amma, meaning mother, are clear gender specific clues. So within the same structure, you find both types of conventions. Such juxtapositioning of naming conventions may sound confusing or contradictory at first, but such layering of conventions are evident and sometimes even common in certain regions. The resulting distinct naming derivatives offer unique insights for family history researcher. Thus, we find the surname or family name being derived from maternal lines in matriarchal or matrilineal societies, reflecting the path that inheritance follow according to the custom and conventions practiced by specific communities. So that's an additional clue as to origin that can be used. Now let's look at the other lens of languages with their origins and variations. Some of the greatest clues for family history research are found in the language used in oral and recorded histories. With more than 20 official languages and dialects, this region offers significant potential for tracing by following linguistic clues. For written records, the scripts offer opportunities to localize the focus of research. Likewise, for oral records, the linguistic patterns of pronunciations hold great potential for regional identification. Earlier, we tried that example of Rama versus Raman as lending us some more directional capability. But the actual scripts that I'm going to share here will help us also clue into origins. So let's look here for our first clue right on the top. We had the name Patel appear, and that name Patel is a name found in Gujarat, the state of India. Here's another one. Towards the bottom, we see the name, a slight variation from Patel, but Patil, which is shown in the Hindi script. Here's another one, Nair, in the Malayalam script of the state of Kerala. And yet another one, a slight variation to some years from Nayar to Nayadu, which is in the Kannada script from the state of Karnataka in southern India. And in Arabic, the name Muhammad. And here in the Tamil language, the name Amma, which can be found in both Tamil Nadu, the state in southern India, as well as Kerala, or even some other of the southern Indian states. And then lastly, in Telugu script, the name Krishna. So there are two ways to look at this. The map on the left reflects the location names such as states and provinces in the scripts of the predominant language of the locale. As you can see, again, going back to our one example, on the southwest tip, that thin piece of land is the state of Kerala, written in the Malayalam script, and so on and so forth, all across the subcontinent that you can see. The map on the right identifies the language families of these predominant languages in their respective regions. Now, there's some debate about origins of some of the languages, but for the most part, the southern Indian part has Dravidian languages, while the north has Indo-Aryan languages. And the Indo-European language of Sanskrit is the root for many of the languages of the region, not all. Next, let's look at it through the lens of locations. Sometimes looking at family history from the perspective of locations can aid our research. In this approach, we could begin by understanding the drivers for the dispersion of first-generation migrants. I'm looking at it from the standpoint of diasporas or dispersions, or where these migrants were destined for, because there might be some underlying patterns that might be discovered through that process. In this approach, we could begin by understanding the drivers for dispersion, such as trade and economic drivers, colonization, indentured labor, or even information technology. These could be considered trade and economic drivers. And another one might be education and research as a driver of immigration, for example. And yet another one could be faith-based religious drivers. So we know that there's been indentured labor during the period of colonization of those of origin from the Indian subcontinent, who can be found in diverse places such as the Caribbean, Trinidad, Tobago, Suriname, or the Pacific for that matter, in places like Fiji. So there's, or even parts of Africa. What this does is understanding these drivers may lead to connections with locations, such as ports of embarkation, and represent migratory patterns of particular periods. So that also helps those who are third or second and third generation or later identify the ports of embarkation and trace back from that common point based on the period in which the immigration took place. For the remainder of our time, I'd like to focus on what's available. the original intent of what's available, and how they can be priceless possessions in the context of gathering family history. A tradition of oral histories exists in some of the communities of South Asia. They can be formal and informal. The formal oral histories sometimes have connections to religious contexts. The informal ones sometimes might be trending toward folklore. Likewise, physical records of the region also span a wide variety of sources, once again ranging from religious to secular. Government records are found in plentiful in some areas, particularly post-colonial period. And then we have records that you can find in religious contexts, such as pilgrimage records, or depending on the type of religion, or burial records for Christians and Muslims. And there are many religious-based records found. As we look increasingly to digital sources, and we're finding a growing number of records that have been either scanned and documented through indexing and other ways, through sources such as familysearch.org or archive.org, even Wikipedia, are proving invaluable in aiding family history research. Now, in conclusion, the pursuit of family history for me is a means of connections. It gives me a foundation that reinforces our commonality. At the same time, instilling a growing respect for the great diversity that exists. I'm also recognizing somewhat of a universal, deep-rooted yearning for kinship as I associate it with those who want to research and compile their family history. All this seems to have an underpinning of sense of eternity, that families are eternal, that gives it deeper definition and meaning. Family is a defining influence in my life. The principal focus and purpose of family and the study of its history is to learn, love, and serve. In this respect, the family is valued as the fundamental unit of society, and the home as the substance and foundation of social fabric. To that end, I am honored to have shared a few thoughts with you today, to connect and to unite, and to learn and to serve and to grow. Thank you for this opportunity, and I'm open to any questions, Anna, if there's anything that anybody would like me to cover in addition.
Thank you so much, Madhu. Yes, Catherine asked a question. She said, you talked about variations in naming conventions. Is there one legal name for a person, or does the name always depend on the context?
That's an excellent question. The legal name is an evolving structure, meaning there has been in the subcontinent and at various points for those who immigrated from the subcontinent, the challenge of trying to, as I mentioned earlier, trying to fit it into some of the other conventions that are common, such as first name, middle name, last name. What we are finding increasingly is that in parts of the subcontinent, you have legal names that are associated with the local setting. For example, if we were to take India, there are multiple languages that are official languages. Typically, you find Hindi as an official language, English as an official language, and the language of the state also as an official language. So increasingly, the legal name structure seems to evolve in the direction of what the practice is at the individual state level. And that structure might be sometimes unique to that area, but a surname or family name versus a given name, those more common elements might be included in the structure, but in addition, you might find additional pieces of the name, additional parts of the name in some areas. Does that help with how the legal required documentation is? And of course, now that is being defined in, clearly by the governing bodies on what fields need to compose that name. There were periods even into recent history where birth certificates were not common, but that is changing, and increasingly legal names are being used across multiple documents from birth certificate on for identification purpose, with an attempt to bring some common structure, but still variations are quite evident within the region.
Thank you. We have another question. Generally speaking, when did birth certificates begin to become common?
More so from the last three decades, I would say, maybe even 4 decades, is when it has become more common. And now, of course, being required. So that's the nature of evolution of the legal structure. Earlier documents that were typically found, with names and their structures were maybe property documents, wills, and other documents related to inheritance. But even there, the structure didn't exist. And so at least it wasn't a standard pattern that you find. But because from birth certificates on, now there's a standard that is being attempted, you're finding that structure being standardized across future documents for identification purposes that occurs in a person's life, whether it be records for education or records for other types of identity, driver's license, and what have you.
Thank you. And that leads into our next question. Do you have suggestions for finding physical records in India, for example, religious or government records?
As with any research, I would generally suggest beginning with looking at online sources, and at which point, if that doesn't yield much, then it would be important to try and see what localities you might be able to localize your research efforts. And that would determine the nature of religious and government records that you will be able to access. So if that triangulation method that I described earlier leads you to a particular region, then that helps you focus and identify, once again, in conjunction with digital research, what government entities or religious entities might potentially have records available for physical examination, if it is not already archived. Speaking of which, archive.org, I have been very impressed and surprised at the number of things I've found there in terms of memoirs and books that have been printed by a family member, which is not very common, but I've been surprised to find that there. So that might also be a good way to approach the research that you're looking into.
Awesome, thank you. Are there any other questions? Someone said Catherine said, thank you, great webinar. And okay, so then I'm going to share my screen. Okay, well, thank you so much, Madhu. That was a wonderful webinar. And thank you everyone for joining us today. We hope you will join us next week with Catherine on census records and basics, benefits, and cautions. And a recording of this webinar will be made available next week. You can view that on our YouTube channel or our website. If you have any comments or questions, you can always email us at fhl_webinars@byu.edu or follow Facebook and Twitter. And thank you so much. Have a wonderful week.